The Syrian civil war was caused by a combination of causes. Originally, the tendency to move to other villages intensified due to the economic reactions, employment difficulties, and poor conditions caused by refuse. And the death of citizens was greatly intensified and as anti-government protest and intensified aimed intense public sentiment. Also, the Syrian civil war is a globalization war because it's not just a war of power that exists in Syria, but it's also a war of direct participation by other countries such as Russia, the United States, Turkey, Israel.
Initially, it took on the form of a democratic insurgent force consisting of Syrian soldiers, officers, and opposition figures who had defected against the regime's crackdown. But over the decades, it had a combination of the Islamic fundamentalist tendencies of Aleppo and Idlib locals and their sponsored Muslim Brotherhood. Their division of the line became visible in July of 2012 when rebels lost the 4th Panzer Division in the first siege of Damascus. In addition, the forces of secular insurgents continued to shrink as Saudi Arabia and Qatar focused their support on radical Islamists. Eventually, in 2013, when government forces launched into a counterattack and the rebels repeatedly lost, Islamic fundamentalists split into the Islamic Front, ISIS, and Al Qaeda, respectively. And secularists lost control and fell. Syrian rebels began to take on the Islamic fundamentalism.
And the President Obama, which actually aided and abetted the civil war, received a lot of criticism at home and abroad, adding to the Crimean crisis and spreading skepticism about President Obama's foreign policy throughout the US. In the end, the ruling US Democratic Party, which was already in crisis, suffered a series of defeats from the 2014 US midterm election to the 2018 US midterm elections, becoming an opposition party and going through a dark period for 4 years before re-establishing power with the US presidential election in 2020. It is the most representative example of the Arab Winter, which refers to the social and political unrest that Arab countries suffer after the Arab Spring, along with the Second Arabian Civil War, the Iraq Civil War, and the Yemen Civil War.
The root cause of Syria's civil war is that Alawi, a Shiite tribe that contributes all government posts, controls both military and government posts, but Shiites account for only 25% of Syria's total population. Alawi is an adjective for Ali in Arabic, which means those who follow people for which means people who follow Allah. On the other hand, Sunnis, which account for nearly 75% of the population, were almost excluded from the government posts. In particular, Sunnis classified them as heretics of Islamic descent, judging that the Shia Alawites are aiming for secularism against Islamic fundamentalism, as the Shiites have implemented radical socialist policies since taking power. Complaints from the Sunni leaders, landowners, and urban commerce and industry have inevitably increased. In other words, the root cause of the Syrian civil war today is social order inequality. That doesn't mean that their dissatisfaction with social inequality represents the legitimacy of the civil war at all. So the timeline of this conflict is very complicated. So this conflict started in 2011 on March 15th with the first Dignity Day organized by the anti-government demonstration, and citizens are outraged that children are basically criticizing against the government, and they basically dragged the children out, tortured them, and then the government has been shooting many citizens ever since, and it escalates protests. In July, a mass anti-government protest goes across Syria and total of more than 1 million people. Sunni countries, including Saudi Arabia and the U.S.-led Western support, has started to fight back. Late July. In November, the Arab League agrees to sanitize Syria. In 2012, in February, the UN votes in favor of President Assad's resignation resolution, 113, 12 against, and 17 abstaining. In April, the Syrian government forces rebel ceasefire in the UN, in effect, which is through the United Nations mediation. In 2013, in February, the UN Security Council says that the war has killed 70,000 people in 2 years. In April, the U.S. announces that sarin gas was in use within the Syrian region. And in August, the Syrian government forces chemical weapons out and towards civilians in the capital, Damascus, killing about 1,400 people. In 2014, the Al Qaeda was declared war upon by the Syrian rebels, which is a militant. Since then, more than 1,000 people have died in a month within that month of fighting against Al Qaeda. In September, U.S.-led international ally launches an airstrike into Syria to defeat the ISIS. 2015, the previous year had killed 76,000 people. February, Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says about 210,000 have been killed over the past 4 years. In September, Russia will support the Assad government to defeat ISIS. Military intervention in Syria. So Russia has sent forces in then. In October, Russian-backed Syrian government the um, airstrikes the massive refugees in Aleppo, which means that Russia basically accidentally hit their own innocent civilians. 2016, the government forces ceasefire to aid the civilians to evacuate, basically. In 2017, the UN rejected a resolution calling for a fact-finding mission on Syria's chemical weapon attacks, opposition to Russia, and and it was abstained from China. In November, Assad and Putin declares end military operations in Syria. Syrian Observatory says 343,000 people have died in the past 6 years at that point. In February of 2018, Syrian government forces airstrikes on rebel-held areas in Idlib provinces, spraying chlorine gas killing more than 100 residents, by accident probably, but they didn't know. The government forces a intensive offensive to recapture the rebel-held eastern Ghouta, a discriminate bombing of civilians. February 24th, the UN Council unanimously adopts ceasefire. 7 years in March of 2018 since the Syrian war, about 350 deaths since then. October 2019, Turkey launches an offensive into the Kurdish region of northern Syria, days after the U.S. says it would not fight in such an incursion. And from February 28 to March 5th, Turkey and Russia-backed Syrian government forces came into direct confrontation after dozens of Turkish soldiers are killed. Confrontation ends after a ceasefire is brokered by Turkey and Syria's ally, Russia. Since then, Russia has become a world enemy by invading Ukraine in 2022.
Okay. There is a major force in Syrian civil war. There's a couple of big groups in Syrian civil war. The number one is the Syrian government and Syrian opposition forces. And there's Islamic State of the Levant and Northern Syrian Democratic Federal System and Russian Federal Army, the US, Turkey, and Israel. It can be said that the US and Syrian opposition and Russia and Syrian governments are interdependent. On the first surface, the Syrian government and the Syrian opposition are fighting the war within Syria's territory, but in reality, they are the United States, Russia, Turkey, Israel, the Arab Union, and the other Islamic group of Islam. Therefore, it is not possible to say for certain which power exercised control within Syria. And there's peace and conflict in Syrian civil war. Syrian civil war has been assault and violence against civilization from the beginning. The international community has imposed san- sanctions, including criticism on the action of the Syrian government, but it didn't work at all because of Syria's already ruined social structure and economic and political situation. Regardless of rebels and government forces, they brutally killed socially disadvantaged people such as children, women, and the adult. The reason why many Syrian refugees have occurred is that peace, human rights, equality, freedom, justice cannot be found there.
Now, with the Syrian conflict, we must look at Galton's triangle theory. Galton believed that there are three starting positions to the conflict: attitudes, conflict in physical form, or contradictions to the local political beliefs. In this case of things, the contradictions or the conflict can light the spark to the beginning of the conflict. While the Syrians did do a peaceful demonstration in the beginning, in contradiction with the Syrian government, I personally believe that with the peaceful demonstration, it sparked the conflict as the government released actual soldiers with live fire weapons and many other improper ways to attempt to calm the people. Rather, it created the opposition, shot everybody up in arms, and hence why the Syrian civil war has occurred.
The Syrian civil war is still a war in progress. It's a war that's been going on for over 20 years. It is safe to say that there is no way to slow the Syrian civil war. This is because the longer the war, the more complicated the intersects between the countries and organizations concerned.
Experts say that the end of the Syrian civil war is impossible for the two sides to develop positively or develop their economic, social, and political systems. Many non governmental and human rights groups have tried to, and failed to suppress them in the early stages of the Civil War, claiming the non-violence clause, which has totally not worked since. Since the country is currently in a state of collapse, the first step is to solve this problem for the Russian backed Syrian government to rebuild the country and establish a regime. However, Russia is currently at war with Ukraine, as everybody knows, and is an enemy of the international community, except for minuscule amount of countries like Belarus and basically any other former Russian territory that wants to come back. So if the Syrian government is supported by the Russian government and it will be establishing a country, it will become an enemy of the international community and hence will be seen as not a country and the sovereignty will likely not be recognized again. However, if the national government establishes it around US backed rebels, the same problem and situation will likely occur again someday. This is the Syrian government, and thank you for watching.